Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP. Want to become a billionaire in days? Well, then just quit your job and become a botnet master. We'll tell you about a story of a Brazilian botnet that you've just got to hear. Plus a major flaw in Android, encryption done right, and then it's a great big batch of your questions and our answers. All that and a heck of a lot more in this week's episode of TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 170 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly Systems Network and Administration podcast. We stream this episode live on July 3rd, 2014. This episode is brought to you by our three fine sponsors, Ting, DigitalOcean, and IX Systems. I'll tell you more about those great sponsors as this here show goes on. But our live stream, that's powered by the incredible Scale Engine over at scaleengine.com. You should really go check that out. My name is Chris, and joining us every single week is our host, the admin, the tech, and the teacher, Mr. Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris. Everybody, thanks for watching.
Hey, Alan. So we had quite a busy week here at the JB Studios because I was gone for a couple of days. I'm back, though, today. I drove over the mountains to make it for today's episode. Through the mountains and over them, Alan. I felt like a little bit of a pioneer, and I was on a trek to find and discover the land of TechSNAP. What do you think of that? Is that great or what?
Sure.
And you're actually out, where are you right now as we record this episode when this airs?
When this airs, I will be at the computer lab at Cambridge University in the UK with a bunch of other FreeBSD guys doing FreeBSD stuff.
The very select group of folks is at that.
Yes. One of the things I'll be helping work on is supporting 64-bit Linux apps under Linux emulation.
Oh, you're a saint, sir. Wow. Are they aware that you hate Linux? Did they know it? That's not a disqualifier.
Well, no, basically, specifically, it's I hate Linux, so when I have this one Linux app, I want it to work on FreeBSD.
Right, because it gets.
I'm going to help work on that.
I see the motivation there. You're a complicated and deep man, Alan, but it makes sense. Yes. Speaking of another complicated and deep man, Mr. Brian Krebs. Krebs on Security's got our first story this week. Where are we starting, Alan?
Yes. He stumbled across or was kind of given the information about a botnet running in Brazil that apparently is rampantly stealing money from banks.
Oh, that's my favorite kind of botnet.
A second similar botnet that RSA has been investigating, RSA estimates that it's entirely possible that they've stolen billions of dollars with this botnet.
Whoa,
although
really?
It kind of seems like it would have been bigger news sooner if they were actually getting away with billions. But
well, yeah, maybe. But I have been noticing lately about some security stories that break. We have one in the Roundup that was sent in by a listener, and it's another banking story where in this case it's millions, but it's been happening in Germany, and we're just now hearing about it in the U.S. So it seems like it seems like sometimes outside the U.S. these things take a long time to sort of circulate around the world.
Yep. But in Brazil, the most common form of payment for everything from paying the government for taxes and services, or paying for utilities, or buying stuff online or in person, and almost every business-to-business payment is this thing called a boleto bancário, or just a boleto, which, if you see the picture there, is kind of like a cross between like a check and a wire transfer or something. And it basically transfers money from one bank account to another bank account. Because most people in Brazil do not have credit cards, because credit is hard to get, especially in poorer countries, and because credit card processing is expensive for the merchants. Right, the stores, they lose 3 to 5%, sometimes as much as 15%, depending on the industry and stuff. And also, with most credit card processing, the merchant has to wait 30 days to actually get the money that they charged, and that can kill a business when they're sitting waiting for 30 days to get paid.
Sure, absolutely.
And also, credit card transactions are reversible, right? Somebody can buy something and then be like, "Oh, no, I didn't," and you have to get the money back.
Right.
The boletos usually only take 24 to 48 hours and have a low fixed fee that's about $1 US for each transaction instead, which is obviously, once you're spending a couple of dollars, that is a lot better than the 3 to 5% that the credit card processing is going to take.
Yeah, for sure.
And unlike credit card payments, boletos can't be disputed or reversed. If a company needs to refund a payment, they actually have to do it separately as like a bank transfer. There's no refund system built into it.
Right. So that saves them a ton of money.
Yeah. So the information is filled out on a form, and the recipient enters. When you receive a boleto, you enter that information online, type in the stuff off the form, and then the money gets deposited into your account. So Brian Krebs was shown a botnet that has been lying in wait on infected computers. So the botnet goes out and infects all these computers. And then when they see someone depositing a boleto, as the user submits it, they modify the destination account and send the money to themselves instead.
Of course.
Right. And so it's not, the details aren't there, but it seems it's probably like a man in the browser type attack. Right. So it's something that gets installed in the browser, and so it can modify it before it gets encrypted for HTTPS. And so what Brian actually found was on the botnet controller was a list of the transactions. And you can see where the money was originally going and where they sent it instead and how much money. So there's a picture of that if you want to show that to people. So in the one Krebs found, the thieves had hijacked 383 separate transactions between February 2014 and the end of June, which is just a couple days ago, and had stolen the equivalent of about $250,000. And this was just a small-time botnet by probably just a couple of people, or maybe even just one guy. And, making $250,000 in half a year is not bad, right? Then researchers at RSA Security, which is part of EMC, which is a bigger company, have found a much larger botnet. RSA says the fraud ring it is tracking, known as bolware, affects more than 30 different banks in Brazil and may be responsible for up to $3.75 billion US in losses for those banks.
Holy smokes.
RSA arrived at that estimate based on the discovery of a similar botnet control panel that tracked nearly 500,000 fraudulent transactions. Most Brazilian banks require online banking customers to install a security plugin that hooks into the browser and adds security, right? However, the plugins are designed to help block the malware attacks, but according to RSA, the bolware gang's malware successfully disables those security plugins, leaving customers with a false sense of security because they thought, oh, I have this banking plugin for my browser and it's supposed to make me more secure.
That just seems like a really bad idea to be a bank to say, okay, we are going to release and maintain this plugin. And then if there's any vulnerabilities in that plugin, it's the bank's fault. Plus, then it makes it a specific target.
Exactly. And it just gets disabled in the browser and the user doesn't notice or whatever.
Yeah, it's like you've seen...
it definitely seems security theater because if the plugin was required to make the online banking stuff work, then disabling it would, the bank would be like, hey, your security plugin isn't working.
Well, and then
obviously something's going on.
The other question is, do they require... I mean, it's a browser plugin, so is it specifically only functional on certain versions of the browsers? Does the bank frequently release updates as new versions of Firefox roll out? Is it IE only? Does it hold browsers back, make them more vulnerable?
Yeah, and also, it seems like the bank isn't actually requiring the use of the plugin as strongly as they think they are if the malware can just disable it and it still works.
Probably because it's probably to avoid tech support calls because they probably get a ton,
But it just seems weird that banks are getting into like the antivirus business by building their own anti-malware software.
I worked for 2 years for a company that had their own plugin for their own website stuff that they did is proprietary to them. You wouldn't think that releasing a web browser plugin would generate a lot of tech support calls. It probably generated, 4 to 5 calls a day, and that's on a user base of probably about 15,000 to 20,000. It was, very specific, industry specific.
Especially back when you were talking, browser plugins were rare.
Right.
Even now, I don't think most people have a lot of browser plugins. That's more of a power user.
That's part of the problem now. Is like a lot of browsers disable them on updates, and they're doing a plugin now is very difficult. It's really a lot more clunky.
And most people that end up with browser plugins didn't want them.
No, right?
They end up with like the Ask. It's like Internet Explorer and toolbar. You end up with like the Ask toolbar and the Yahoo toolbar.
And then with IE and stuff, you have the problem where if they don't have administrative rights, sometimes they can't install certain things. Even browser plugins, sometimes they can. It's awful.
Yeah. Awful. And so RSA notes that the miscreants responsible for the bolware operation used over 8,000 separate accounts to receive the stolen funds in hopes of, few of the not all those accounts would get frozen, and so they would be able to get the money out. Whereas the botnet Krebs discovered was much less sophisticated and had 3 bank accounts.
Yeah,
but
they're just getting started.
The RSA one is obviously fairly well organized if they have 8,000 bank accounts set up for pilfering the money out. And, if they've actually managed to make off with billions of dollars.
Yeah. Yeah, 3.75, right?
Well, this is just an estimate RSA got by like multiplying what they saw by how much they think it's actually happening. So the number's pretty much just made up. But
okay, maybe that's
got
another
the
reason.
headline.
That's another reason why we don't hear about it quite as much, because there's a solid number, a solid cost.
Well, Krebs is like, well, this one guy I stumbled across made a $250,000, and there's a lot of people that could do that in the States.
Could you imagine just sitting back and just collecting what most people would consider an incredible like annual salary, and this person can just collect it in a few weeks worth of work?
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah. So they found about 500,000 fraudulent transactions.
Okay.
And they also found the malware that the Bullware guys were using was actually stealing other credentials, so they could get into your email and use it to infect your friends, or get in your Twitter and tweet links to the malware and all kinds of stuff. So they had 83,500 sets of credentials to log into different things that they had captured with the malware, and they had infected over 200,000 PCs.
And 30 different banks. Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, the 30 different banks is interesting because it means they were maybe rolling solutions for 30 different iterations of online interfaces, 30 different versions of username and password systems, and potentially third, question and answer stuff. So that took some serious work. Or all those are using sort of similar. Maybe they're all owned by one parent company or something. I don't know. But in the screenshots they have in the PDF that Alan linked in the show notes, you kind of get some screenshots of some of it too. It's very interesting. It goes into a lot more detail. Good graphics in this PDF, huh?
Yep.
This is sometimes the PDF are all text.
It's a serious.
Yeah, that's true. They got the money to have people work on these things. That's very true. Yep. Yeah, here's a shot of the multi-factor authentication stuff.
There's them stealing on page 18. There's showing them stealing Microsoft Live.com account username and passwords.
Yeah, there it is. Look at them. Boy, this is really similar to another story we're going to cover in the Roundup. I wonder if it's related.
Basically, for now, if you live in Brazil and use these, RSA recommends using a mobile device and using the barcodes, because currently the malware can't steal those transactions. I'm sure the malware will adapt, but in the meantime.
This is interesting, Alan. On page 25, they have a OS victim distribution usage. 78% of the victims were using Windows 7. Then followed by
17.2 on Windows XP.
Yep.
Which is a lot less Windows XP than you would expect, especially in Brazil.
And then 8. The next one is Windows 8, and then there's a tiny sliver of Vista. So there's already way more people running 8 than there is Vista.
Yep. And the other interesting one is about 50% of people in Brazil that were affected still using Internet Explorer.
Yeah, but 34% were using Chrome.
Yeah, and 17% Firefox. Would expect to see that Internet Explorer number go down, but maybe not.
I guess this also tells us that this is the new generation of sophisticated malware that can be that can infect the browser that doesn't require Internet Explorer. Because I was actually kind of making the assumption a lot of these people were on IE, but this clearly states
half of them are. But
yes, yeah. I mean, the majority are 48.7%. But the fact that the Chrome is at 34% of victims, that's a higher number than I honestly expected. I expected the IE to be more like 70%.
But yeah, okay. So that $3.75 million number or $1 billion number is what RSA came up with by just summing together every transaction that was stored on the CNC server.
Yeah,
it's not. They don't know whether that much was actually stolen, but that's how many transactions showed up there and were attempted to be redirected anyway.
So they don't know if they were all successful.
No, but it was less of what I thought. I thought they just saw how much that one did and then assumed there were a whole bunch more of them. But apparently this is all just from the transactions they were looking at.
Boy, this PDF is great. Wow.
And they break stuff down by days and stuff.
Oh, the stolen credentials by domain 94% hotmail.com.
Yeah, well, that was one of the ones they were targeting. Mm-hmm. And also apparently popular with Brazilians.
Yeah.
But based on that, it seems that the average transaction was for $7,500, which seems very high.
Yeah. Were they buying like a motorcycle or a car or something? That's interesting. All right, Alan, any other thoughts on that story?
No.
That's a fascinating one. I recommend if you guys are interested by this, go look at the PDF that Alan linked.
The PDF is definitely worth a read.
I feel like we say that all the time, but this is one of the best ones we've seen for a while. All right, I want to tell you about our first sponsor this week, and that's the great folks over at IX Systems. Go to ixsystems.com/TechSNAP if you would. Go there right now. Just visit it and check it out. See what IX Systems has to offer, and it also lets them know that you appreciate them supporting the TechSNAP program. And what a good idea to remind them at the beginning of a new month that you appreciate their support. So ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. Now, why have we picked IX Systems? Actually, I want to clarify something. We didn't just pick IX Systems as a sponsor. You see here, the Jupiter
picked us too.
Well, and let's. I'm gonna totally put it all out there. Like, I pursued them for a really long time, and finally, Alan sealed the deal and said, "Hey, look, now we got all this BSD stuff. You guys love BSD. Come on our shows. We love you guys. Just give it a try." And you know what? The best part has been,
it helped that I managed to corner them in person.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, got them. Let me tell you something. We can do good stuff for you. And you know what? It's worked out so great because the Jupiter Broadcasting audience just instinctively knows quality when they see it, and that's what IX Systems is. Everything from the servers they build with those Intel processors, the white glove service, the way they can customize a solution that it's not just sort of shaping something they might have off the shelf to work for you, but literally build something specifically for you that's exactly what you need.
Yes, and the other thing is that they can do it quickly, which is oftentimes it's either, you get something off the shelf or you can custom order something, but it'll take a while. But with these guys, it doesn't, half the time that it takes is the quality assurance stuff they do to make sure the server's going to work when you get it. And, the fact that I can order a server and know that I'm going to get it in a reasonable amount of time is a big win for me. Because before, when I was buying, parts for servers and building them myself, some of the times it would take like 3 or 4 weeks in order to get shipped one of the components. Mm-hmm. Especially like the chassis itself, the main component. It's easy to get processors usually, although if you want the fancier server ones, sometimes not as easy actually. But it always came down to be this hassle where I was going to get parts at different dates, and it was like, is it all going to get here in time for me to get it together and put it in? And with IX, I just know that it's going to take about this long, and I'm going to get it, and it's going to be what I want.
The other thing that
it's going to work
for me,
There's no guesswork,
really works well, especially like when I'm planning a project and I know, okay, I'm actually pretty good at estimating I'll need this much time for the equipment to arrive, to assemble it, do some quick testing, and then deploy this thing into production. And what I'm really bad at, and this is just something I've never been great at, is when there is a failure that sort of interrupts the whole process where, like, okay, we can't move forward until this is resolved. I don't schedule for that, right? I have stuff scheduled after that. So what has happened to me is those projects, they just go in the corner and they stay there for weeks and weeks, an embarrassing a long amount of time. Sometimes like hardware, it will iterate in the time that thing sits in the corner because I don't have time to schedule it again until I get back around to then fixing it. Even if that's just calling up for support, right? I just don't have time to deal with that. And then, so that can push things back for me months. And what's great about IX Systems, they do burn-in testing. Now, nobody's perfect. Hardware can have problems, but I would tell you this, IX Systems takes their best effort to make sure that when you get that hardware, it is ready to go and it's compatible with your open source software.
Yeah, most hardware, if it's going to have a problem, it's going to have it near the beginning. And so they take that time out of the equation for you by running it and replacing anything that's not perfect before they ship it to you.
Yes. And the other thing I like is IX Systems are experts, and like sometimes they'll flex their muscles on their IX Systems What's New blog. They have how to fix the IPMI remote management vulnerability. And this is just, isn't this nice? Like, that these guys are following this stuff. They know what's going on in the industry. They know how to solve these problems, and they're proactively thinking, boy, I bet enough of our customers might be affected by something like this. Let's address it on our blog. And that's not something, they're not getting paid to do that. They're not charging you for this. This is just part of the service because they have people there who are passionate about the industry, that follow these topics, that are working on this stuff themselves. And so they figure, why not also give some value to our customers? That's what's so awesome about IX Systems, is that philosophy permeates throughout the entire company. So go over to ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. You can check out the free white paper that gives you the ultimate guide to buying a new open source server. 11 key traits you got to demand from your provider. You can maybe send this up the chain if somebody's having a hard time moving away from another hardware provider that's maybe not been as great as they should be. Yeah. Check it out. ixsystems.com/TechSNAP. And a really big thank you to IX Systems for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. Okay.
Yes, also, check out this week's episode of BSD Now.
Which is out right now.
It'll actually be...
Oh, yeah, last week.
It's next week's the one I'm talking about is next week's, but it'll air the day before this does.
Episode 44, base ISO 100? Or are you talking about next week?
I'm actually talking about 45.
All right.
So episode 45 of BSD Now, we have an interview with Josh Petzel, who's the director of IT over at IX Systems, and he tells us some war stories about him doing support for people that were having problems with giant ZFS machine, and how he, on Memorial Day weekend, when he was supposed to be off, drove into the office, loaded up a couple hundred terabytes of storage in his truck, and drove down to the customer and got them back online in time for the resume of business.
Too awesome. Awesome.
But it was just great war stories. I've got to hear some of his other stories in person, and he's a great guy.
You just bring him back, have future war story interviews. That sounds like a fun series.
He's already been on BSD Now before. He's actually the first person to do 2 interviews.
Oh, wow.
If you remember, he was Santa Claus.
I do remember that. That was awesome. That was
yes.
epic. So you guys got Santa on again. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, not dressed as Santa this time because it was summertime.
I know, Alan. I know. But he's still Santa in my heart.
Yes.
Now, I've been told time and time again, never, ever cross the streams. But what about encrypting the streams, Alan?
Right. So this is a blog post by Adam Langley, who works at Google on security stuff and is actually the guy that announced the Boring SSL project.
Yes.
And he has a post here about dealing with encrypted streams and specifically with message authentication codes, and talking about how many file encryption systems, including GNU-PG, actually do it wrong. So when you encrypt a large message, you often have, when you encrypt a message, you usually have what's called a MAC, or a message authentication code, which is basically a thing that goes at the end and allows you to verify that the encrypted version you got hasn't been messed with.
Okay.
So that you can, because, an attacker could, because it's an encrypted message, the attacker can't change what the message says, but they can randomly change the ciphertext to screw up the message. And so the MAC allows you to tell whether that happened or not. Right? And but the problem is those are usually at the end of the message. And so when you treat your encrypted thing as a stream, you don't read the authentication code until the end, and you can't compare it until you have the whole file to be able to compare the message authentication code.
I'll follow.
So the problem is that if you run something like GPG and then -D for decrypt and some GPG encrypted thing, pipe to tar. So if you have a tar file and somebody encrypts it with GPG and sends it to you, and you use GPG -D and then pipe that into tar to extract it, if the message or the file's been messed with, either if it accidentally got corrupted or if somebody purposely messed with it to try to cause problems, now GPG is going to, when it gets to the end of the file, be like, hey, error, sorry, this file was bad.
Yeah.
But because you piped it into tar's already created all the files.
Yeah.
And then it's got the corrupted message.
Yes.
And so it's not going to uncreate those files.
I've had this happen to me, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And so someone could purposely mess up the archive to cause tar to, if tar had some vulnerability, it could exploit it.
Sure.
It could just create random files. They could do all kinds of different things.
Sure, yeah.
Right. And because it's spitting out into a pipe, it doesn't do it until, it doesn't check the MAC until the end.
Yeah.
And so...
you wasted your time.
So the correct way to handle this is to not return the data until it's been authenticated. However, that might require an impossibly large buffer, right? Like if your tar file is 500 megabytes, you don't necessarily want to keep all 500 megabytes in RAM until you can verify it all before start writing to the pipe. Right? So Adam talks a bit about doing something like breaking the message into 16 kilobyte chunks with a 16-byte MAC on each chunk. So that'll make it slightly bigger, but only by 0.1%. So that's not that big of a deal. Right? And so then GPG could authenticate each chunk of 16 kilobytes. And then once it knows it's good, it could write it to the pipe. And now, since you're only waiting for 16 kilobytes at a time, you don't need a lot of buffer space. And tar isn't waiting, doing nothing the whole time until you get to the end of the file.
Yeah, right.
The problem with that approach is, although it's safer in general, when chunking, one has to worry that an attacker hasn't reordered the chunks, right? So they could cause them to be in a different order or something, or hasn't dropped a chunk that from one of the spots, right?
Yeah, I follow. Like, what would they do that? Like some sort of network capture and then retransmit?
Well, yeah, if they're the NSA and they're doing a man-in-the-middle attack or something, then yeah. Or a couple different ways.
In fact, the NSA did this. They call it quantum insert, where they intercept and And they do it by putting their facility closer to upstream, so that way they can respond faster than the originator. So that way they're not even interrupting. They're just getting the question and giving the answer faster than the originator can.
Yeah, and so they can do stuff like that. And basically, they could cause the tar file to be missing some important file. And then when you extract it, it's missing something that's critical to make it work or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so just breaking it into chunks doesn't really solve the problem either. And so he kind of just talks about the different approaches and how there's no one answer yet. And then Ted Unangst of OpenBSD and LibreSSL posts his thoughts about it. And specifically, he read Adam's blog post and then started thinking, well, what about all the encryption tools I've written, and how does this apply to all of them?
Sure.
Because he wrote Signify, the OpenBSD tool for verifying the install files before you install OpenBSD or the package system.
Okay.
And so the way Signify works is they changed the installer. Before, what it would do is the FTP client, which is also an HTTP client, would download the file from wherever your source is, and then it would actually just pipe that directly into tar. So as you're downloading it, you're untarring it. You're not storing the tarball anywhere. You're just extracting it immediately.
Okay.
Obviously, they didn't want to do that once they had Signify, because they want to make sure the whole file is valid before they start extracting it. So now they download the tarball, and once it's completely downloaded, they run Signify on it, and only if that succeeds and the file is completely good do they untar it. The downside is that requires a bit of temporary storage space now. And then with the binary package system in OpenBSD, the way it works is it verifies the checksum of each file. So what it does now is extract the archive to a temporary directory, verify the files, and then only if they're verified, install them to the right place. So it can cause bad files to be extracted, but they would be in a temporary place that would get cleaned up afterwards.
Okay.
And then he talks about another tool he wrote called REOP, or Reasonable Expectation of Privacy, which is a lightweight but not compatible replacement for GNU-PG or PGP.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Not compatible, though.
No, it doesn't. It's more for when you don't need the whole thing. You just want like the bare minimum feature set.
Like encrypting and decrypting files.
Yeah, or messages.
Yeah.
He says, however, the entire message must decrypt and authenticate successfully before any output is produced. So it's actually safer than small packet streaming program, which may produce partial output, right? Because the problem with that, doing the checks, the MAC on every 16 kilobytes is you'd have your output until you found one that was bad, and then you would stop. In a tarball, that would give you a bunch of files and then stop. Mm-hmm. And so you'd have the partially extracted files that were okay, and then you just stop as soon as you run into a problem. Well, to be perfect, you want it to not do anything if there's a problem. So that's what his does. He says, but his tool cheats a bit by imposing a message size limit. You simply can't encrypt large files for large values of large. He doesn't actually specify what the file limit is.
Right, yeah. Well, maybe it's based on, what, resources?
Yeah, it might actually just be based on what your system can handle.
Yeah. It's like, it's going to have a limit. I just going to depend on what your box can do.
Yeah. But it's just interesting to see, Adam's talking about just theoretically what's going on here, and then Ted actually applied it to tools he had written and changes that have been made in OpenBSD specifically to prevent some of the stuff Adam was talking about.
Yeah. What do you think about, on here, he also mentions on Twitter, Zuku points out Tahoe LAFS. I was actually thinking about taking a look at that in LAS. He says, this is an example of getting it right. Additionally, taking the MAC of the current state of the digest operation and continuing operation has been proposed for storage functions for Tahoe FS. So it looks like they're looking at some of the stuff he's talked about too, but Tahoe FS is interesting because it's like it's an open source distributed file system that's encrypted.
Yep.
So I think I might do an episode on that
it seems to do, it stores a MAC of, basically when you're calculating the digest, or like the SHA-256 hash, so every time it reads a chunk and generates the hash, it then max what the hash is so far. And so you get kind of this hybrid where it would seem that you would have the MAC of each chunk and then maybe an overall MAC, so you can make sure the chunks are in order or no chunks have been moved around or anything.
I might do this soon.
I haven't really got a chance to look into this Tahoe FS stuff.
Yeah, this is one the audience has been writing into me about for forever, asking me to look at. So I think I might do this really soon.
It looks interesting, but I don't know how
what the performance would be or anything like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, there definitely has some testing that it needs. And it looks like interfaces to Tahoe FS include web browser, command line, obviously mounting it using Fuse, and FTP and SFTP clients. Some of them support it too. Interesting stuff.
Yep.
Well, there you go. That's why you should encrypt the streams, I guess. Not even if you have to cross them. All right, Alan. Any other thoughts on that one?
No.
Okay. Why don't I take a second to tell you about our next sponsor then, DigitalOcean. Go over to DigitalOcean.com. We got a brand new promo code for the month of July, everybody. That's right. It's Snap July. Let me tell you about DigitalOcean. They're a simple cloud hosting provider dedicated to offering the most intuitive and easy way to spin up a cloud server. I have their $5 rig right now, and I've been running it for months and months and months with all kinds of little activities. All of my IRC clients in the studio are powered by my DigitalOcean Droplet. My BitTorrent sync between the studio and my house are powered by my DigitalOcean Droplet. Right now, I'm playing with an instance of OwnCloud on my DigitalOcean Droplet for $5 a month. And here's what you get. Aside from the fact that you can create one of these DigitalOcean Droplets in less than a minute, about 55 seconds, the pricing plan is so straightforward, and it makes so much sense. It starts at $5 a month. You get 512 megabytes of RAM. You get a 20 gigabyte SSD. You get one blazing fast CPU and a terabyte of transfer connected to tier 1 bandwidth. And DigitalOcean has data center locations in New York, San Francisco, Singapore, and Amsterdam. Their interface is simple. Their control panel is intuitive, and power users can replicate that control panel with their straightforward API, which I have been told is a damn fine API. Go over to DigitalOcean.com and check out some of their features. Not only do they have that 55-second provisioning, those SSD hard drives, but they've got them all on top of amazing hardware using KVM virtualization. In some of their data centers, they support private networking. So you can have systems on the back end like database servers or whatever it might be. Maybe you have cache servers on the front end, and your actual web servers, maybe they're on the back end and their queries are getting proxied. That's a possibility with DigitalOcean. The great thing is those private instances don't count against your bandwidth total. They have global image transfer, so you can move things around if you need to load balance. And of course, with the droplet system, you can create a snapshot and then deploy that when you need to. Super fast, super easy. And when you use our promo code SNAPJULY, you're going to get a $10 credit. Well, if you get the $5 rig, you can run that for 2 months for absolutely free. But check out their pricing. They have a little switch option right here. You can switch this over to hourly and see what their hourly pricing is. Now think about that Snap July code for $10. Think about how much computing you can get on demand for testing, for education, for offloading when you need to just increase capacity because DigitalOcean's got that tier 1 bandwidth in those SSD drives, right? Look at that hourly pricing. Then use that promo code SNAPJULY. I am telling you, go check out DigitalOcean. And by the way, they're also hiring. They have a great community already, so I would imagine working there is probably a real treat. So check it out. DigitalOcean is shipping code daily, and they need your help. They have 6,000 plus physical servers, 6 different data center locations, and 1.4 million plus droplets have been launched. So go check it out, DigitalOcean.com. Use the promo code SNAPJULY. And a huge thank you to DigitalOcean for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. Love my droplet. Okay, now moving right along in the news, it has been a big week. Wow, look at this. This Android key store Stack Overflow flaw in 4.4 sounds extremely interesting. Tell me what's going on.
It was in 4.3.
4.3 fixed in 4.4, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Okay, tell me all about it.
So Android has a system called a key store, which is basically how Android stores anything it wants to keep secret. Basically, it's where you store cryptographic keys like RSA keys and SSH keys.
For like
stuff
a VPN
for online
app.
banking,
Yeah.
VPN keys and passwords, authentication stuff for like your Twitter account.
Right, exactly. App
Anything
tokens,
anything an app needs to store that needs to be protected is put in this store, which on some phones is actually even hardware backed, right? On the newer phones where they have the separate CPU that just does the crypto and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then also things like your PIN or the pattern you use to unlock the phone is in there. And so there was a flaw in it that was a Stack Overflow because, it's funny. If you look at on the story on the securityintelligence.com, there's a chunk of the comment from the source code for it where they specifically say is like, make these buffers bigger than they will need to be so that we won't have to worry about doing bounds checking.
Right. Oh, no.
Yeah, exactly. Like here, I can quote it. It's key store is a secured storage for key value pairs. It is an implementation. Each file stores one key pair value, or one key pair. Keys are encoded in file names, and values are encrypted with a checksum. The encryption key is protected by a user-defined password. To keep things simple, buffers are always larger than the maximum space we need. So bounds checks on buffers are omitted, except for turns out that if you send an overly long file name, it breaks.
Ouch. Oh, come on, Googs.
Yeah. So this would actually allow someone to get the encrypted data, specifically by doing. Now the phones do have a lot of mitigation for this type of thing.
Yeah, like
Right?
memory
They have
and randomization.
Data execution prevention, which is supposed to stop a buffer overflow from being able to execute code.
Sure.
Address space layout randomization, or ASLR, which moves stuff, when you allocate memory, it gets put around randomly, so you can't tell. If I grow out of this box, I'll overwrite this particular chunk. And also stack canaries, where they find when the stack's been overflowed. And things are encoded before they're written into buffers and all this stuff. However, the Android key store is respawned every time it terminates. This behavior enables a probabilistic approach, and the attacker can theoretically abuse ASLR to defeat any of the encoding that's done. And you can bypass the data execution prevention by doing return-oriented programming, or ROP, which we've talked about a little bit before. So the impact is you could leak the device's lock credentials, since the master password is derived from those lock credentials, which is the number or pattern you used to unlock the phone. Whenever the device is unlocked, so you could watch it and eventually find out the code and then be able to decrypt the store. It could leak the decrypted master keys, data and hardware-backed keys from memory or disk for an offline attack. And you could interact with the hardware-backed storage and perform crypto operations like arbitrary data signing on behalf of the user. So you could actually, once you take over the key store, you could use it to sign stuff as the user.
Oh, of course.
So if they had an RSA key or a PGP key or something on there, or take over their Twitter account or whatever. Now it goes on to mention that most bank apps will require you to log in every time. Like Twitter doesn't, right? So when you fire up Twitter on your phone, it gets the credentials from the key store, and you can post stuff. Yeah. So if someone gets your Android key store, they can post stuff as you on Twitter until you revoke the app. With banking, most online banks won't let you just auto log in when you're at the phone. It'll make you have to log in again. And so the attacker won't have your password if that's not saved on the phone. But anyway, turns out that it's only vulnerable Android 4.3. Originally, it was thought that all previous versions of Android were vulnerable to this.
Yeah.
And that's why originally the story was reported as 86% of all Androids are vulnerable.
I was going to mention that. Yeah. A funny story, Alan, is I think it was Tuesday's Tech Talk Today. I ran the story in there. And when I print, because it's the morning, I print out all my stories just to make it easier on myself. I printed out the wrong version. And I was about to go on air with the wrong version, where I was about to say 87% of Android devices. I happened to refresh, because I already had the tab open. I refreshed the Ars Technica post where they made the correction. I got to tell you, Al, that's a pretty big
URL,
difference.
Because they have a permalink URL, the URL still has the original title, even though they changed the article.
It does. 86, it says in the, that's funny.
Yeah. All right. So it turns out it affects about 10% of all Android devices, which are those running 4.3 that haven't upgraded to 4.4 yet.
Yeah.
However, I'm lucky my device is stuck on 4.1. So this one particular vulnerability, I'm not vulnerable.
What about Heartbleed? What about, do you know what?
I don't think it got the fix. I'm not sure.
Oh, jeez. Gosh, what a hot mess.
The vulnerability requires a malicious app be installed on the handset. So in order to steal your key store, they actually the attacker code has to be running as an app on your phone.
Yeah.
But in the past, we've seen legitimate apps be bought by bad people and have stuff injected into it. So everybody updates and now they have this malware on their phone or whatever.
Yep.
Or hacked, some company, has an app and then somebody breaks into their Google account or whatever and replaces the app. Or, it's pretty easy to trick people into installing an app, right? You make a new fart button app and everybody installs it. And
we just talked about that app. What was it, a month ago, that was attempting to mine cryptocurrency on people's Android phones that was being distributed through the Play Store. The next day, Google did pull it from the Play Store like 2 days later or something like that. Took them, basically, all in all, it took them like 4 days to respond. But in that time, thousands of people installed this application that was mining crypto coins from the Play Store. So it can happen. It is possible. And in that case, it was an app that had been around for like a year, if you recall.
Yeah. So this one is a quote from a professor that does like Android security full time. He says, generally speaking, this is how apps are going to store their authentication credentials. So if you compromise the key store, you can log in as the phone's users on any service where they've got a corresponding app, or at least an app that remembers who you are and lets you log in without having to retype a password. This means that most banking apps, which force you to retype your password, will be safe from this particular attack. But, VPN, PIN numbers, any app that doesn't make you type in the password every time you want to use it, which is most, would be vulnerable.
Wow.
And then, we have the link to the actual security post from the guys that found it.
Yeah.
There's also a short timeline here. They originally found the problem in September of 2013. So they privately disclosed it to the Android security team.
Jeez.
The vulnerability was acknowledged on the same day by the Android security team, which is a good response from them.
Yeah.
On October 22nd, they asked the Android security team for updates. And on November 11th, the security team confirmed that was fixed in 4.4. But they waited until June 23rd to announce because they wanted to give people time to upgrade to 4.4.
Wow. That is a pretty, from September 9th, 2013 till June 23rd, 2014, for something that can leak credentials or allow you to.
Although, it requires, having an infected app and stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
And it only affects some versions and so on. But
yeah. That's one version, right?
It was better to wait probably and hope that because at one point I'm guessing the percent of people running 4.3 was a lot higher than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now that 4.4 is out and people who can upgrade probably have.
Let me see. You know what? Let's take a look. I think they tell you. I think they publish this stuff. Android. What would you say? OS distribution stats. I'm going to check because I think Google publicly publishes this on like one of their developer sites. So that way developers know what to do. Yeah, here it is right here. So here we go. Looks like 4.3% is currently Android 4.3 is currently installed on 10.3% of devices that connect to the Play Store.
Yeah, and KitKat 4.4 is 13.6.
Yeah.
So judging by that, probably about 25% of devices were on 4.3 until 4.4 came out.
Yeah, Jelly Bean right now is the big dog at 29%. Boy, this is so...
4.1, because technically 4.1, 4.2, and 4.3 are all...
Oh, you're right. Yeah, I'm sorry. 4.1 of Jelly Bean. You're right.
Is 20, and that's because people with older phones like me are stuck there.
This is pathetic. This chart right here is the biggest problem I think that Google has with Android out of all the other issues. Because everything below 4.4 could have security problems of some nature.
Yeah, well, they
not that 4.4
solve that by actually supporting the older versions and releasing, why is there not 4.1.12 or something, right?
Can't be done, Alan. Can't be done. Just can't be done.
Well, and they could probably do it for some stuff, but, most of the carriers have moved on because they want you to replace the phone, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not in any particular party's interest. Google wants you to have the new shiny. Carriers want you to keep renewing that contract, and OEMs want you to buy new hardware. So nobody in the chain is incentivized to actually update those freaking OSs.
Or to support the older ones.
Yeah. And users suffer for it. All right, any other thoughts on that?
Nope, that's about it for that story as well.
You know what? I'll tell you about, this is actually great. This is the perfect moment ever, if there ever was one in the TechSNAP program, to mention Ting.com, because Ting actually changes that. Ting is incentivized for you to get the most value out of the phone you buy. That's how Ting works. No contract, no early termination fee, and you only pay for what you use. It's a flat $6 per month, you guys. It's $6 per month, and then it's just your usage on top of that. If you think about it, the cell phone companies have duped you, and it feels so old now. This model feels so old if you really think about it. They're getting you to buy like what? How many minutes are you buying? Like 100 minutes? 10,000 minutes? What is it? What do you got? I don't know. For me, it was like I had to have 800 minutes. Got to have 800 minutes, or else I just don't know how many I'm going to go over. And that meant minimum. Just for me, I'm almost at $100 a month once you add in data and text messaging. Ting changes all of that. You pay the flat $6, and then it's your usage on top of that. If you use some data, you pay for the data. If you use some text, you pay for the text. If you're on Wi-Fi and you use your data on your Wi-Fi, then you're not paying into some big data plan that has some sort of crappy cap. You just pay for what you use. Go over to techsnap.ting.com to get started. That's going to take $25 off your first device. If you've already got a device, they'll give you a $25 credit. And Ting recently introduced support for Sprint-compatible iPads. So if you have a Sprint-compatible iPad and you're like, gosh, I would love to turn on the modem in this iPad, but I am not going to pay, $40 a month to have data when I might kind of need it. So now that you can take Ting's pay-for-what-you-use model and apply it to tablets, Doesn't it make so much more sense than how you do it previously? And now think about that across all of the products that Ting offers. All of their phones are like that. And if you add a new line to your account, it's just, again, you pay for the usage. It's $6 for that line. It's so straightforward. It's so simple. I want you to go over to techsnap.ting.com right now and try out their savings calculator. Just plug your information into that and tell me, Chris, you know what? Bro, you were right, man. I'm going to save so much money. If you're not, that's fine. Maybe Ting isn't for you. But give them a call, too. 1-855-TING-FTW, anytime between 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. business hours, and a real Canadian answers the phone. And what I like about Ting is, like, Ting takes these Canadians and they're like, we're going to empower you. And there is nothing more useful in the world than an empowered Canadian tech support person. I'm not even kidding. That's that's perfect. Like, even that makes sense. TechSNAP.ting.com. Go check them out. They're so awesome. I've been using them for well over a year. And one of the great things is, since Ting is incentivized for you to get the most value out of the computer in your pocket, that's really how Ting sees it. They see themselves as a mobile ISP, and they see this as a computer in your pocket. And so for them, no reason to delay that 4.4 update. No reason. I got it right away on my Nexus 5. You can go get a Nexus 5 from the Play Store and then move it over to the Ting network. And what that is exactly how the mobile industry should be. You pay a fair price for an unlocked phone that is full of features. You put it on a network where you pay for what you use, where there's no contract, no early termination fee. It really is how I hope the entire industry goes, and you can help push it in that direction. TechSNAP.ting.com. And a huge thank you to Ting for sponsoring the TechSNAP program. And a big thank you to all of you out there who visit TechSNAP.ting.com, just to let them know, hey, I appreciate you supporting the TechSNAP show, and check out their blog while you're there. Even if you're not a Ting customer, lots of good resources on that blog, and some good app picks as well. TechSNAP.ting.com. Thanks, Ting. All right, Mr. Jude, is there anything else we want to cover in the news segment?
No, that's about it.
All right, I'll give an obnoxious plug because it's something that I think would appeal to the TechSNAP audience. I pre-recorded episode 19 of Tech Talk Today since I was out at a cabin, and it's a look back at two different operating systems that all the analysts thought were going to dominate the computer industry. One of them, I bet most of you out there know. Another one is from a company you would never expect, and you've probably never heard of, but promised to be amazing and revolutionize things. And I covered those in episode 19 of Tech Talk Today. So I want to recommend you go check it out if you want a little more show. But Alan, with the news all done, that means it's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Thanks for sending your emails to TechSNAP at JupiterBroadcasting.com or clicking that contact link at the top of the Jupiter Broadcasting website, or even better, being a TechSNAP Pro and taking out just a few minutes of your busy day to fill out that beautiful form over at links.techsnap.tv and submitting it to our brand new subreddit, which we just launched today. Sure. Our first email comes in from Esteban. He's following up on the mortgage fraud story we had where... we were kind of like, is this worth it, doing all this for just to break mortgage fraud? And he says, as a person in the tax field, for various reasons, I've been watching this court case very closely. I guess I could keep a long password that's impossible to remember and find a way to delete it or claim that I destroyed the password. This is about the forced decryption. Not that I'm planning on doing anything illegal, but where does one draw the line? Does the government have unlimited right to force one to decrypt the data? Oh, and by the way, this person was using TrueCrypt, he says. What do you think, Alan? Is there a spot? I don't know how it works in Canada, but here in the U.S., it seems like to me I have the right not to incriminate myself, right? I shouldn't have to be able to decrypt my data. It seems like it's a violation of I plead the Fifth Amendment, whatever, the Fifth, whatever. I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank now, but it seems like people have a right to not incriminate themselves. And if you're forced to decrypt something that would incriminate you, how is that any different than? Well, I guess they can force you to open up a safe, can't they?
Yeah, and so it's.
I guess it's kind of like, I guess they're using that as sort of a precedent, maybe. Yeah,
and so basically, it's something that kind of straddles these lines, and it's like, well, we don't know where it goes, and the problem is that the first couple of cases kind of decide how it's gonna be forever, and it's like, well,
yeah. And this actually isn't the first time we've heard about this either, that Esteban. So this is one of a couple of court cases like this now. My gut tells me it feels too far, but when I look at legal precedent, it's hard to say. Who knows? We're not legal experts, as demonstrated by our conversation we just had. All right, Alan. But we can get onto some tech stuff. We're a little bit better at that. Viewer Chris writes in. He says, "Hello, host. I'm quite sure I'll know the answer from both of you, but if you could provide me to some documentation on what backup is, I'd greatly appreciate it." Now, he says, I think he's trying to figure out disaster recovery and backup. He says, okay, here's some background. Up until the last week of June, my company didn't have its own SVN repos being backed up automatically. Occasionally, someone would run SVN admin dump, copying the data from one server to another, but both servers and the hard drives are about the same age, probably about 7 years old, so at any time, both drives could die. Anyways, we have a simple script copying that to some Mac server and then to a crash plan. Real question is, though, I don't exactly know how our production backups work, but the standard answer is that we have a disaster recovery site. Pretty sure it's a hot DR zone, so management's response is, we have a DR, that's good enough. Obviously, a working copy of your data is not a backup, but management may not think that way. Do you have any documentation on standard backup policies or procedures or practices, and in general, what backup is and is not? He has also a link to typesofbackup.com. But he is wondering if we have any other tips. He says he's been watching since about the 20s of TechSNAP.
Okay, so in general, a backup is when you have an archive of what a file or database or whatever, in this case, an SVN repo, looked like at different times, right? So if you take a daily backup, then every night that SVN repo gets copied somewhere else, and you keep more than one copy, right? You have every version for the last week, and then one from each week for the last month or something, as far back as you think you might need to be able to go in case somebody broke the repo somehow and you need to be able to undo something. So that's a backup. Now, disaster recovery is kind of more encompassing. It's everything you need to do to get back up and running after something happens. So if your office where those two servers are burns down and you have this hot DR site, that would mean that you just change your DNS or whatever, and all of a sudden everything's running off this other location, right? So your disaster recovery plan could be, all right, we have backups that are offsite, and if our servers break or whatever, then our disaster recovery plan is to rent some virtual machines from DigitalOcean, restore the backups to them, and get up and running again. Or it's, we're going to get servers. Are we going to go buy servers somewhere, or do we have some somewhere where they wouldn't be affected by the same problem, where we can get a server from somewhere and restore the backups to it and get it back up and running and so on. So generally, your disaster recovery plan is everything that has to involve where you're going to get the servers, how you're going to back it up, testing that the backups actually restore properly when it's going to a different machine and so on and all that. Kind of how much data is acceptable to lose, right? If you only do a daily backup and you do it at midnight or something, well, what happens if the crash happens at like 4 o'clock on some day? You would end up losing everything you did that day. And is that acceptable or not?
He seemed to imply they had
hourly backups.
He seemed to imply that they had a hot DR site, like maybe even live syncing of their data, which if you really truly have a totally live DR site, I'd like to meet that. Could you introduce me to that? Because I'd like to see how that really works. Totally live, like all your data is always synchronized. Really? But he says management's using that as that's good enough. That's good enough.
Right. Well, and a hot DR site, it can be delayed by a certain amount of time, depending how you do it. If it's snapshots every 15 minutes or something, that works. But it depends.
Yeah, 15 minutes would probably be okay for most businesses.
Yeah. So it's about deciding how much data you can lose and how long it's going to take to restore. Because if you're backing up all your data and you're going to restore it to some server, well, if you have 4 terabytes of data and you're uploading it to some remote server, that could take a while. Right?
Yeah.
And so that maybe isn't an acceptable solution. Maybe your solution is we have, our backups consist of, we have these hard drives we can slap in some server and it'll boot up and work or whatever.
He says their offsite backup is Crash Plan. Now, I don't have anything against Crash Plan, but that is not an enterprise solution. That is not an industry grade solution. I mean, maybe if it's like an office of 20, 30 people, maybe, and you're talking a couple of servers.
It's a small office, but if they have a DR site, it's hard to say.
Right. And most disaster recovery sites I've seen, the way they actually operate, the ones that actually work, are fairly fresh. But if it's something where you really have to switch over, you have to have backups because you have to usually bring the last day or so back from backups into your DR site and run from there. Most of the times.
Yeah, like most times what you have is, say, like an hourly backup to a local server, and then once a day you sync that to the DR site.
Yeah. I mean, there are ways to do it live. I acknowledge that, but usually,
part of the problem there is it uses a lot of bandwidth, and maybe you don't have that.
I mean, I am somehow I'm putting this out there. getting from his email that they're cheap. I'm just telling you, I'm picking that up. So I'm not thinking
they're using Crash Plan.
Yeah.
Kind of suggests.
And that they won't pay for backups. Also, that they have to justify the need for backups when usually now the computer systems are the most critical component of a business. So anything that keeps that going is a good thing because the business depends on it. And so the fact that you have to justify to them indicates to me that they're not thinking about things in their true value. So I don't know. It's hard to know, man, about your particular setup, but I would say build them the case for, look, we need to have data backups not just for all the hard drives die, but potentially we need to roll something back. Bob made an error in a spreadsheet.
We do something and it just corrupts the SVN database. Especially now, SVN stores stuff instead of separate drive. You have one master database. If that somehow gets corrupted,
you're screwed.
Then
And what if you discover you need to roll back like to a month ago because something's been wrong for like 3 weeks, right? And so you just want to be safe and go back a month.
That's the difference between a backup and a copy.
Yeah.
Or if you're just copying it to a second server once an hour, the problem is what if you don't notice in time and you copy the corrupted version and overwrite your backup?
Yeah.
Right? That's why a backup should have multiple points in time to allow you to go back.
I mean, even Dropbox does this. Like, even Dropbox does versioning, and there's a reason for it. And hopefully Crash Plan does, too. I'm sure it does. My wife uses Crash Plan, but I haven't checked it for a while. That's just
the biggest
not
thing with offsite is getting the files offsite, which often is done over the internet, which is often not fast enough to be able to do everything or do it often enough.
Yeah, look at what's that? There's a really campy, what is it? 321 backup, 321 backup. Let me check that. I think that's the saying. It's a digital photographer wrote it. Yeah. Check out 321 backup. It's essentially, it's over at dbbestflow.com. And it's their overview for their professional photographers and their rule. They have a 321 rule. They recommend 3 copies of any important data. We recommend having files on 2 different media types, and 1 copy should be stored offsite. So 2 different media types and offsite. So if you have 1 copy and then 1 offsite, that's not a backup. And I think this is a good philosophy to follow. So I'll throw a link to this in the show notes too.
I'll throw a link to an article I wrote back in 2009
about
backups, and it talks about your recovery point objective, the delta T, and the recovery time objective, or RTO. So the recovery point objective is how much data you can risk losing. The recovery time objective is how long you can be down before that's not acceptable. And then, like that. So you have to decide, how fresh does our backup need to be, or our restored version? How fresh does it need to be compared to the live one that went down? And then how fast do we have to be able to get back up?
Yeah.
If we lose a whole server. And oftentimes that's, your recovery time objective has to be very short. So you have to, plan for that and basically have a server that you're basically restoring your backup to constantly or something.
Alan, I want to get to our next email because Rich is actually going to ask a question that I've been meaning to ask you. So it kind of works out perfectly. It's about ZFS and copy on write. He says, I've moved my VirtualBox VM images to my FreeNAS 9.2.x, which is a Supermicro-based Core i3 with 32 gigs of RAM. He's using 4 drives in a ZFS RAID Z2 based on Western Digital 4 terabyte RED drives. I understand that ZFS will make a copy of a file and write changes to the copy. So how does this work with large files such as virtual machine images? Does it just make 1 copy on write? Is it constantly making copy on write images? If my VM images are, let's say 100 gigabytes, is FreeNAS constantly making 100 gigabyte file copies? I have a Core i7 based desktop with a Samsung SSD drive running Integros with VirtualBox. The VM images are accessed via NFS to the FreeNAS. I observe significantly more FreeNAS disk activity than VirtualBox disk activity than what it shows in VirtualBox. With that little icon. Mm-hmm. He says, for example, a couple of small blips on VirtualBox's disk icon will result in the FreeNAS disk indicator being pegged solid for a while. Overall, performance is very acceptable unless I leave the VM idle for a bit. Then, when I try to use it, the VM appears to hang for a few seconds, about 10 seconds, and the FreeNAS light is pegged again until the VM comes back to life. I'm guessing the pause is FreeNAS making another 100 gigabyte copy on write. I assume this is normal behavior. I'm just looking to understand what is going on in the background. It may impact how many VMs I fire up concurrently from FreeNAS. While this configuration is currently for my own private use, he wants to offer it to clients, which I think is a great idea. He says, thanks in advance. Longtime listeners enjoyed the entire back catalog, Alas, Unplugged, TechSNAP, SciByte, Unfiltered, and now he's working on his way through BSD Now. Damn! So what do you think, Alan?
He's misunderstanding how copy on write works. So copy on write doesn't work on the file level, it's on the block level.
I was wondering.
So basically what happened, and it's not making a copy. That's not how it works. What it means is when you go to overwrite part of a file, instead of overwriting it, it just writes the new block somewhere else. So it's not actually copying anything. It's just when you write a new block, instead of overwriting it, it writes it somewhere else and keeps the old copy.
So just make sure I'm tracking, because I've been wondering this myself. So what ZFS is actually doing is saying the old version of that's on this block, and I've written to a new block. And what the actual magic is it's remembering that old block has a copy of the original data, right? Am I following?
Right. So if you don't have any snapshots, it's not actually doing anything. All it does is it writes to a new location instead of overwriting, so that if the write only half finishes, it can go back and give you the working file from 3 seconds ago instead of the broken bit, right? So if the power goes out in the middle of writing a new block,
gotcha,
it goes back to last time the file was perfect. So you lose like 1 second of data. As opposed to if it was overwriting, you would now have a file that was screwed up, because you would have half the new content and half the old content, right? It's called a shorn write when that happens. So ZFS prevents that by always writing to a new location. Then once it's written the data to there, it updates the index to say the file's over here. If you have a snapshot, originally, when you make the snapshot uses no more space than the original version, right? All right. So with the snapshot, you basically have two versions of that 100 gigabyte file, or two versions of every file in the data set that you snapshotted. Mm-hmm. But it takes up no additional space because all the blocks are identical. And then just as you write changes, the live file system gets those new writes, and the snapshot keeps its copy, right? So each block basically, ZFS keeps track of how many times each block is used, right? So when you make a snapshot, every one of those blocks is now used by that snapshot.
Okay.
And then when you write new data, the new data is only used by the live file system and not by any of the snapshots. And then say you delete an old snapshot and there was a block that was only being used by that old snapshot, that can now be freed up.
Okay.
Because it's not in use by any snapshots anymore.
Right.
And that's how you eventually don't run out of space. So when he's doing this, the biggest chunk that ZFS will use is 128 kilobytes. But it's never actually doing the copy operation that he was assuming it was. And also copying a 100 gigabyte file would probably take on the order of 10 minutes, even at like 200 megabytes a second, right? So it's probably not... a 10-second pause isn't it copying 100 gigabytes. That would at the max speed of a regular spinning disk, if under like ideal conditions, doing a copy like that would take 15 minutes on a single drive. And on 4 drives in RAID Z2, you'd probably look at it would be at least 10 minutes to copy 100 gigabytes.
Yeah.
So it's not that.
I have though
but
also,
it never actually does a copy like that.
I have also observed the same phenomenon when I have a VM that's been idle.
So
for a while.
what's happening there? Well, I don't know about the idle thing. I think that's just the NFS client has to restart the session or something.
Yeah, I mean it is an NFS mount that is connected to the FreeNAS.
I'm not sure about that part. But what he's looking at is that ZFS on that giant 100 gigabyte file is using 128 kilobyte chunks. But the file system in the VM is writing in 4 kilobyte chunks. So when you write 4 kilobytes, it asks to take that 128 kilobyte chunk, change the one block of it, and write the whole 128K to a new block.
Right.
And so it is doing some copying there.
Right.
And so yes, each write will take longer that way.
So you
can change the record size to avoid that, or you can use zvols, which have a native smaller block size.
Oh.
But if you want to know the right answers, we asked these questions to a real ZFS expert on BSD Now, episode 45.
45. Yeah. So are you saying I should have a separate volume just for my virtual machines that has a smaller block size?
Probably. But also, honestly, I would do a separate ZFS file system for each different virtual machine.
Really?
So you can snapshot them separately.
Oh, yes.
Right. So if you make a data set called VMs, and then under that a separate data set for each different VM, you can snapshot individual ones separately, or you can do a recursive snapshot of the root one and snapshot them all at once.
I love that.
So in case you're saying, there's this one virtual machine and I'm just about to upgrade it. So let's do a snapshot before, just in case.
Alan, you got to fly back out here and help me reset up my ZFS setup, because it's not how I did it. It's not how I did it.
You can just create the extra file systems and then move the files. And once the old one's empty, you can throw it away or whatever.
Okay. And
as long as you have a little bit of free space,
or
would
it also maybe make sense to adjust the block size in the VM, or you think that's not a route to go? Adjust it up for the specific.
That's in the file system, and you can usually only change that as you're formating the file system in the first place.
That's true. So you'd have to do it.
Most of them probably won't even allow you to do 128 kilobytes as a big block.
Yeah. Okay.
And the problem with doing that is it means a 1 kilobyte file would take 120 kilobytes of space.
But if you match that up, so if you have a separate volume for the VMs with a smaller block size,
it might help. But again, you should listen to what Josh said instead of what I'm saying.
In 45.
Yeah, and because we talked about when you're doing it with iSCSI, you've got all these different numbers. Like iSCSI is doing a block this big. The file system on the virtual machine or the physical machine that's using over iSCSI has a block this big.
Yes.
Your network has a block this big. And then the client has a block this big, and it's accessing the virtual device at this size, and then ZFS has this size block.
It's a mess.
And how does these all interact? And it turns out ZFS usually just does the right thing. And so it's hard to say what performance things he's seeing or what he was seeing when that was pegged and so on. I definitely look at things like zpool iostat 1 will print out the stats from the pool every 1 second. And also if you have an SSH shell running gstat will show each hard drive and what its actual read and write IOPS are and how long each operation's taking. And based on that, it'll try to figure out like a percent load for that disk, and you can tell how it's going.
Okay. That's probably a great.
What that stall he's seeing is, but sure
that's a great way
to a fix for it.
That's a great way for him to dig into it, though.
Yes, someone asked the question kind of like that on the FreeBSD forums, and we posed it to Josh, and he gave us a bunch of great answers explaining.
Man, 45 sounds like that's going to be one not to miss.
Yes, if you want to know about ZFS, we have one of the experts on ZFS from IX Systems telling us A, a war story about ZFS, and then B, answering that question about how all the different block sizes between iSCSI, your network, should I use jumbo frames, and all of that actually apply to running virtual machines over iSCSI.
Oh, very good.
And most of the same should apply to NFS.
All right, so Rucent88 in our subreddit has to ask the question about the elephant in the room. I don't know, Alan. This might get you incriminated. It says, "Hey, Alan, how did you manage your passwords prior to LastPass? In the last TechSNAP, you said that you're now using LastPass to manage your passwords, but I'm really curious to know, what was the quote-unquote old method that Alan used to manage his passwords?"
A combination of remembering passwords and not having enough separate ones, and a PGP encrypted file on one of our servers that myself and my business partner had access to read the passwords we had to share for like all of our ISPs and so on.
It's like on a server that only you guys had access to that was encrypted.
Right. We would have shell in and then GPG decrypt it with your password and stuff. It was kind of cumbersome and couldn't always easily be accessed on the road and was really hard to use on your phone. And
yeah, for sure. Yeah, the phone thing is a definite one. All right, Rude Shmingadinga writes, and that's actually, I think, pretty close to how you say his username. He says, "Hello, Alan, Chris, and fellow TechSnappers. I'm faced with a task of choosing groupware for a small nonprofit of about 10 workplaces. I wonder if he means work machines, or I'd love to install FreeBSD box. They already have one running with an OwnCloud instance. Now, there seems to be so many different solutions I could run for groupware. The main thing is I want to be able to do mail, tasks, saving emails as tasks for other users." That's more like a client thing, buddy. "And maybe even newsletter capabilities for public relation workers. And it should be an appealing web GUI for mobile folks. It also would be nice if it could be used in Germany because they don't have a lot of money and they're a nonprofit. So the question is, which groupware solution could you suggest we use, and which groupware solution is currently being used in the JB1 studios?" Alan, do you have any thoughts on groupware?
I'm not even 100% sure what qualifies as groupware. Other than Novell groupware from like ages ago that I've never actually used.
It is kind of an ambiguous term, right?
It just means anything for a bunch of people to work together.
I guess shared calendaring and contacts, I think, is what people think the most of.
Most likely is stuff like that, and maybe a message board or whatever.
I'll tell you what. Obviously, the old go-to is Exchange these days, and a lot of folks use that. You're not really in a position to use Exchange. There is Zimbra. This is something that the JB1 Studios are currently evaluating. There's also another open source project that we're currently evaluating called Colab. They have really taken a stance of privacy and security post Edward Snowden revelations. This is an open source project. The great thing I like about this is it can sit on top of open source standard applications for mail delivery. So that means if you ever need to troubleshoot this groupware, quote unquote, solution, you're not like poking around in some esoteric Java-based client that is, has its own unique set of commands. Colab sits on top of open source programs that you can find documentation on. You can look at the config files. So as a sysadmin, that's very appealing to me when it comes time to troubleshoot. They've really focused on security. They're cross-platform. They have a very good mobile client. I haven't used it yet, though. So that's my disclaimer. Zimbra I have actually used. Zimbra, the killer feature about Zimbra, its kick-ass feature, I would say, is unlike that piece of crap Exchange. And I'm sorry, I know, but...
Yes, no, it is.
The thing about Exchange is if you have, in my case, they were clients. I had folks that got... Every email came with a PDF attached, and every PDF was about 40 megabytes, and it was 100 to 200 a day. And they're a lawyer, so they needed to be able to have them forever, like forever and ever, because not only do they need them for court cases, but like lawyers will often go back to PDFs that they've created for previous clients and just repurpose those for you when you go in there for their services, and they charge you a lot of money for it, but they're just repurposing old PDFs that they've already written years ago. And they use their emails to go find those, and then they'll charge you hundreds of dollars. And they want to have access to them at all times from any location that they're at, because you never know what deal they might be doing or where they might be working from. And Exchange does not solve that problem for them. But Zimbra has a SQL backend for the mail store, which is awesome, and it has an incredible search functionality, which is great. The downside to Zimbra is it runs inside Java. It's very esoteric in the terms of administration. It has a custom interface. It is using things like LDAP and SMTP and all that stuff, but it's all inclusive. The nice thing about that is you throw it on a bare bones Linux box, you run their install script, pretty much 15 minutes later, you've got a groupware server ready to go. So Zimbra is very good. There's a few other ones out there. This was a TechSNAP subreddit thread. So if you have any suggestions, I would love to see them, because this is something that Jupiter Broadcasting is currently evaluating. Obviously, our viewer is too. So we'll have a link in the show notes to the thread in the subreddit. If you wouldn't mind going over there and proposing what you have found to work, especially if you've used it for a little while, and you've maybe done some disaster recovery with it or anything like that, I would love to hear that for open source groupware systems, because this is not only a question that we get a lot into the show that we don't have a great answer for, but it's also something that I want to implement right here in JB1 Studios. Zimbra is kind of my front runner, but one of the reasons I haven't done anything yet about this is because I don't really want to use it. So I'd love to hear your guys' answers to that. We'll have a link in the show notes. All right, Alan. We've got a question about, speaking of notes, he says, comes from Greens, I think. He says, I'm looking to build myself a home server. My goal is to have everything accessible from my Android phone, from my GNOME desktop, and, whenever possible, a web interface. I have found projects that look great, like KeyPass and Roundcube for email and password management, Gallery 3 for pictures, OwnCloud for files, calendars, and contacts, Subsonic for his music, TinyRSS for his news feeds, GitLab for his GitHub needs, and EJABBRED. I don't even know what that is. I do all the other ones. He says, one thing I cannot find a replacement for, and I'm curious what you do for this, Alan. He says, I need some kind of note synchronization. One option is to own cloud and use all their notes, but to be honest with you, it's kind of balls. All in all, the lack of features like geotagging, attachments, special formatting, time tags, tags themselves, prioritization, and so on make OwnCloud a no-go for him. So he's wondering what we use for note-taking and note synchronization, and if you have any recommendations.
I'm not sure what kind of notes he's dealing with. I don't really have a thing.
He's comparing it, and unfortunately, this is another reason I put this in the show, is because I'm curious too, and so are folks in comments. The problem is what he's comparing it against is Evernote. And the great thing about Evernote is that it has a really, 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 really good web client. It has a really good mobile client, and like on Windows and Mac, there's a desktop client. But the other thing, that the killer feature about Evernote is that you can take pictures with Evernote and sync it. And while it syncs up to the cloud, it not only resizes it so that way it's not like huge, but it also OCRs everything in the image, so then it's searchable. So when you go back into the client, you can take a picture of a business or an address or a business card. This is the killer one, a business card, and search. So if somebody gives you your card, you just take a picture of their business card, and now Evernote can OCR and search that. And it's really convenient, and it's mobile, it syncs up. And this is something that I've really struggled to replace too, because there's not a native Linux client for Evernote. There's some knockoffs, but what I have taken to do is I just have a series of text files in Dropbox. It doesn't support pictures, but that's how I do it. And then Dropbox works really easy on mobile. And the other thing is there's like on Android, there's the application I use on Android is called Draft. And Draft not only supports Markdown, which is my preferred note-taking syntax. What do you call that, Alan?
Depends, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a markup language. That's what it's called, Markdown.
Yeah. So I prefer to write all of my notes in Markdown. Draft supports Markdown, and it syncs with Dropbox. And then when I'm working on my GNOME desktop, I just have Dropbox sync there. So I would love an answer to this, because I'll tell you, when I went on my trip to the cabin, I feel like I fell off the wagon. I went back on Evernote because I had pictures and links and formatting and OCR. So I just fell off the wagon and went back to Evernote. So I'd be curious to hear what the audience thinks. But yeah, great. There you go. So that is all of our feedback for this week. So we'd love to get more, so that way we can answer your questions. That's one of the things we love doing on the TechSNAP program. Go over to jupiterbroadcasting.com, click the contact link, choose TechSNAP from the dropdown. I know, right? And then just fill out your systems, network administration, file storage, privacy, security, engineering, interesting trivia, all that kind of stuff right there in that form, and send it in the show. Now, if you do have a link you want to send us, because we got a couple of these this week in the show notes, or in the email, and I did manage to put them in the show notes. I did actually find them. But if you want to send us a link, the better place to go would be links.techsnap.tv. That's our subreddit. You can also start up a conversation thread there and ask your question into the show, but also get the input from all of the smart folks who watch TechSNAP. And that's actually more valuable too, so there's a secondary benefit to sending us an email. If you do it to the subreddit, you'll also get input from folks who might have an answer before we do, because sometimes we pre-record and things like that. So links.techsnap.tv.
Yeah, because currently it'll be 2 weeks before you get an answer. So you probably want an answer sooner than that.
Yeah. And we'll still take it in and have a discussion about it if it's a good question. Yeah. And it's great because if there's there's one thread in there right now that I didn't put in the show, because honestly, the commenters knocked it out of the park. They give you links, they give you answers. I'm like, they got it. I don't need to put this in the show. So that does happen sometimes, but that just means you still got your answers. So that's a good place to submit questions too. We'll take them all places, and we like it.
Yep.
All right, Alan. Well, that's all the feedback for this week. So that means it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. Welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that, just didn't quite fit at the top of the show, but we still want to give you some links to follow up on your own after the show. And some of these links were sent in by the powerful links.techsnap.tv subreddit. And Alan, our first story was submitted by Mark, and it's banking malware, kind of like we were talking about earlier. This one, the way they work is they intercept traffic on the network, and it's kind of interesting. It's a research that was being done by Trend Micro that they've released now. They talk about it as Emotet, E-M-O-T-E-T, Emotet. I'm not sure.
Emotet, yeah, I think it's an Egyptian word or something.
Okay. It infects machines through an email message. Surprise, surprise. When they click the link, it installs the malicious software. The sample that was analyzed by Trend Micro was designed to steal credentials for logging into accounts of several German banks, but they warned that the configuration file may vary so that other institutions could be in the crosshairs just by a tweak of the config. Infected once into the browser, it uses a DLL that checks the access websites with the URLs targeted by the malware. If a match is found, all the information is sent to the address as is retrieved. They say that it saves the whole content of the website, screenshots and everything of what is on the website, so they get an idea of what the login screens look like and everything, I assume. Trend Micro researchers found that the credentials used to log into services using HTTPS were also captured by the malware, so they're capturing it as you log in. So
basically it's a man-in-the-browser attack. So it's basically malware that installs as a plugin or something in your browser, or in this case a DLL, and it's capturing all the data before the browser encrypts it to send it to the bank. So they get your username and password, which they wouldn't be able to get by sniffing on the network.
Yeah, and I think the screenshot thing is an interesting way to sort of do reconnaissance too. So even if you don't compromise that user's computer to steal any money, you could just compromise that user's computer to gather reconnaissance on what these login sites look like, what kind of credentials they're asking for.
Well, yeah, it's because they're getting the picture, but also the HTML of the bank's webpage, so that this is what the account balance page looks like.
Right.
So that we can construct a custom one so that when you go and look at your account balance after we've stolen your money, we delete the transaction of us stealing your money and update your balance on all the subsequent transactions to make it look like the money's still there, even though it's not.
And I've wondered, like, how are these guys reproducing the web page so perfectly that users are getting tricked so often?
They would have to be a customer of the bank in order to have access to the seat, or they compromise just one account and get to poke around in it.
It makes sense.
Or this way, you just monitor people while they're using the bank, and then you can hijack them after the fact.
Well, Alan, when you have a link about things going wild, the first thing I think of going wild is Unix. What's this about?
Yeah, so this is Unix wildcards gone wild, and basically it's a thing people have pointed out a bunch of times, and some people consider it a bug and some a feature and so on, but it's just something to watch out for. So when you use wildcards in Unix, especially like the star wildcard, it can do things you didn't expect. For example, say you're using RM, right, and you want to delete all the files in a directory, so you do RM star, and you know that because the way it's set up, it's not going to delete directories because you didn't specify -R. But if one of the files in the directory happens to be named -R or -RF or something, that when the shell replaces the star with every file in the directory, it's going to add -RF. And RM is going to interpret that as if you put the flag in there, not as that is a file. And it'll cause problems. Now, there's ways around this, specifically it's come up before when people want to delete a file that has a minus sign at the first character in the file name, right?
Yeah.
Because if you try to do that, it'll be like, there's no switches called minus Chris.
Yes.
It's like, what's minus Chris? That's invalid syntax. So in RM and most programs that use the same option parsing thing, if you put 2 dashes by themselves, so RM, any switches you want, 2 dashes, then your list of files.
Yeah.
Anything after 2 dashes by itself means don't interpret these, just treat them as file names. Don't try to process them as flags. So this especially becomes important if you're writing scripts. You want to use protections like that, putting that dash in there to make sure that if there ever is a file with a dash in it, it doesn't cause unexpected things to happen.
And that is the origin of the dash right there, right? I mean,
and also there's other ones with files with spaces in them. Depending how they're interpreted, a space will mean these are 2 separate files, and it won't delete the file expected. Or, if a file's blah space minus blah, then it can cause unexpected things to happen. And so on this page, they have a couple of examples of things that could happen and so on, and they talk about it. And it's not really a bug. They're like, well, this should be fixed. It's like, well, no, that would be horrible if they fixed it. Because it would break the way Unix works. But
I also like the examples working with rsync, because that's always like, it's something like working with rsync is really not that hard, but when it's something that's really important that you're backing up, it's nice to read through this and just do a little sanity check,
Yeah, because they show an example of naming a file --reference equals dot some file. And so now when someone does chown, change the ownership of every file in this directory to my user for start.php, now it adds that one file called --reference blah dot something dot php.
Yeah.
So the chown command actually reads that file, and it causes all the files to be owned not by the user you specified in the command, but by the user the attacker specified in the hidden file they created. So that's how you could, take advantage of a chown script in if you compromise a WordPress blog or something. Now, the problem in this case is the way the person actually wrote the command. They're using chown -R, which means recursive and go through the directories, but then they use start.php instead of dot or something. But it just shows how that kind of stuff can happen and why you should be more careful.
Very much. Good link, Alan. That's a good read too, and it's interesting how something.
Because actually, that's an interesting feature of chown I didn't know. If you put --reference equals some file, it changes the ownership to whatever the ownership of that reference file is, instead of you having to know.
Oh,
Makes
that's
it easy to script stuff.
Yeah.
That's cool, but you can see how someone could create a file with that and cause you to chown everything to what they want.
Yeah.
Or specifically, if you're modifying WordPress and the user that the WordPress code is running as, or the exploit is running as, doesn't have access to modify some of the important files, they can create a file that then when the chown runs, it'll switch all the ownership to the user that was able to create that file. And then now they have access to modify, say, admin.php, and insert a couple of lines to add an iframe. So next time the admin logs into their WordPress, they get hit with some malware. And same thing with like, you can use for chmod, you can use reference to pull the permissions off an existing file. So someone does chmod 000 star, but instead of all the files ending up 000, they end up 777 because that's what the reference file is permissioned as.
Alan,
and they show how you can do the same thing with tar. Trying to create a tar archive can end up doing all kinds of things you didn't mean to do, including running a shell script, which could be a big one.
Huh. How would you do that?
There's a thing called checkpoint-action, which will run a shell script every so many bytes. It's for dealing with, if your tape isn't big enough, you can have it, hey, switch the tape to the next drive or whatever.
Of course.
So you can say every 1 byte, run this shell script.
Yeah.
And then you stick that in there, and the next time tar goes to do a backup of this person's WordPress install, it's running your shell script that does whatever you want it to do as the permissions of the backup user, not the web user.
I can't help but just get a glee from that idea.
Yeah.
Exploits via tar.
Yeah. The other fun one is with rsync, you can specify the command used on the opposite end, right? So, if you're rsyncing from host A to host B, I've used the hack, but mine defines rsync-path equals, and then in quotes, sudo rsync, so that on the remote side, it runs rsync as root.
Yes.
So that I can overwrite other. So when I'm copying like 5 users as files from server A to server B,
right,
the root is the only person that would have permission to recreate the files with the right permissions. But if I create a file in a directory I know you're backing up with rsync, I can put, -e sh shell.rc or something. So I can basically cause you, the first pass, you're going to copy all the files. And on the second pass, I'm going to cause you to run the file I added to the directory on the remote system, which may, could be a root exploit or something, allow me to take over the machine. So it shows what can go wrong and why, if you're creating a script like rsync or whatever, you want to use that trick to make sure that you're not having any files with special meanings end up doing stuff you didn't intend.
You know what it shows me is that you can put out extremely valuable content as a text file on the internet still.
Oh, yes.
There you go. Boom. That's just one big old text file right there, ladies and gentlemen. And
most times, that's how you can tell it's good, when it comes out as a text file.
Exactly. Now, this next thing, I'm not so sure is good, but it was sent into the show. I want to talk about it. Have you heard about this Norse real-time cyber warfare map?
Yes, because I know a number of people that work at Norse. It's actually a FreeBSD shop.
So this real-time map they've put out, and of course, as we're recording right now, nothing is happening. Nothing. Like, this map is usually crazy with lights.
I noticed they've changed something over the last couple of weeks, and you can't watch it in Firefox anymore.
I'm in Chrome.
Yeah. Well, I used to get a message saying, hey, if it's slow, use Chrome. Now I get a message like, you have to use Chrome.
So here's why I kind of am semi-skeptical, is because essentially this isn't like a real-time feed from like Googs or the NSA or whatever. This is just, they have honeypot servers set up, and when they detect attacks, it's on the map.
Yes. Well, these show attacks that are targeting everybody or scanning the entire internet rather than attacks that are going after specific.
Yeah, that's a good way.
Although they do have some honeypots at specific places.
Yeah, I mean,
or somebody to talk about where how some of their stuff works, but they are pretty high end. They've detected some 0-day exploits before anybody knew that there was a 0-day.
So do you think this real time map? I mean, right now it's totally dead. Maybe their site.
It's just showing off their data visualization.
It's a marketing thing, you think?
Not marketing so much. It's just a way to look at the data because there's so much of it. It's like, if you looked at that in a CSV file or like a Excel sheet, it'd be like, I can't make heads or tails of this. But with a map, it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty cool to look at. It's one of those things where, like, if I was going to have, like, if I had an office and I was going to have clients over to tour it, because sometimes we'd have our big clients who wanted to come see our offices when I was in contracting for IT, and we'd put things up on the screen, like our real-time monitors and whatnot. And so this would be a good one to go up on the screen. All right. Well, thank you for sending that in to Mr. Anonymous, who didn't want to be named. All right, Alan, our next story comes from Slashdot about a bug in the Fire TV from Amazon. I hadn't heard about this.
Yes. So the Amazon Fire TV is like a little device for your TV that lets you watch stuff.
I kind of want
it has a screensaver that would just show random images or whatever. Well, it turns out the caching mechanism for it was broken. So it would download about 80 gigabytes per day of images to show on your TV. It was blowing through users' data caps and causing them to pay overage fees at their ISPs and stuff.
Not to mention make your connection run slower because it's sitting there downloading. What is it like? What are these 4K images it's pulling down?
Probably, but over the whole course of a day, it actually doesn't add up to that much.
That is funny, though. It makes sense that would. I mean, if you have high resolution displays and you want to have nice, beautiful images for the screensaver.
Yep.
Well, there you go. If you have a Fire TV and you've noticed your bandwidth has been up, maybe that's what's going on. Too funny.
Yeah.
All right. Goldman Sachs, having a hard time understanding how email works, has asked Google to unsend one of the emails it actually accidentally sent to the Gmail domain, right?
Yeah, so basically Goldman Sachs accidentally sent an email to user@gmail.com when they meant to send it to user@gs.com for Goldman Sachs. And they didn't so much want to unsend it as, hey, Google, please go into this person's account that accidentally got this email and delete the email. And Google's like, what? We don't do that. And they said, not without a court order. We don't go into people's account and delete some of their email. So Goldman Sachs filed with the New York Supreme Court requesting emergency relief to avoid a privacy violation and avoid the risk of unnecessary reputation damage to Goldman Sachs.
Wow.
Basically, Goldman Sachs was testing something and accidentally sent an email containing a bunch of their customers' like account balances and stuff to a Gmail account they didn't mean to.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yikes. Hey, Alan, the phrase here that gets repeated often, probably more often than it should in the U.S., is blame Canada. But it's supposed to be a joke, not actually what you do.
Yeah. So Microsoft announced on the 27th of June that they were killing off their Patch Tuesday emails because of the new Canadian anti-spam law that requires like double opt-in to make sure that, spammers don't just say, oh, yeah, the person opted in by visiting our website. It's like, no, they had to specifically opt in and say, yes, I want to get this email.
I think we just recently talked about it, too.
Yeah. And so they said they're going to stop sending the emails about patches, and I think there was a list of things. Yeah, Security bulletin advanced notifications.
Yeah.
So being told that there's going to be an update before there's an update.
Right.
The security bulletin summaries, new security advisories and bulletins, and major and minor revisions to security advisories and bulletins. And they're like, in lieu of the email notification, you can subscribe to one of our RSS feeds.
Here's the thing about that. And RSS is
there's a couple of things. But go ahead.
RSS is a fine way to ingest that kind of information. In fact, maybe it is the better way. But I will tell you the often used way is there is an email box that gets these that IT departments monitor, and then they schedule things based around these emails, and there's an existing workflow that every company out there that's in the enterprise space participates in. This is huge for Microsoft to pull out of. They're not pulling out of all email notifications, but just this alone is huge. But go ahead.
And the worst part is the fact that they're blaming the Canadian law, which the government consulted with Microsoft and made sure that this wasn't going to be a problem.
You're kidding me.
There's specific exemption in the law dealing with like warranty and recall information or safety and security information about a product, good, or service, and all that specifically so Microsoft could still email you about vulnerabilities in Windows.
Well, and wouldn't every
basically Microsoft was involved the whole time and knew all about this.
Wouldn't every major software provider also be having to make these same changes? Like, think of Oracle when they email people out about new updates to Java.
I got an email from Oracle saying you have to click here to keep receiving emails from us because of the Canadian law, and I clicked it. I got like 20 of those in the last 2 weeks.
There you go.
Some of the companies that are doing it are even offering, a prize to try to get people to keep opt-in.
Really?
And one of the guys from the Coalition Against Unsolicited Commercial Email that's backing this law said, I am at a complete and total loss to understand how the people in Redmond made such an apparently panicked decision. Microsoft was closely involved in the discussions with the Canadian government over the bill's trajectory and content. This is the first company I know of that's been that dumb.
Wow, Todd, that's correct.
To underscore that, Microsoft later announced that, quote, on July 27th, Microsoft notified customers that they were suspending Microsoft security notifications due to changing government policies concerning the issuance of automated electronic messaging. We have reviewed our process and will resume these security notifications with our monthly advanced notification service on July 3rd.
Wait a minute.
So they cancel it on July 27th, thinking, yay, we finally get out of having to send emails.
June 27th, yeah.
Giant uproar. Yes, June 27th.
Yeah.
Giant uproar, and in less than a week, they're like, the emails will start going out again today.
Dude, this is classic Microsoft, man. They announce something bold like they're going to do it.
The fact that they managed to turn it around in less than 3 days and be like, yes, in less than a week from when we announced it was over, it'll be back on.
That only takes like a couple $billion contracts to email in and be like, hey guys, no. And then they change their tune. Well, let's transition. One of Microsoft's good friends, Facebook, got people all worked up this week when it came out based on a research paper that was published that happened in 2012 that Facebook intentionally manipulated the emotions of folks that were viewing Facebook. This ran for a 1 week period in January.
Well, Facebook was like basically helping a researcher do research. It wasn't that they were just doing this.
Right. Yeah, it was. However, the study was not like. Generally, when you do studies on people, it has to be signed off by a scientific health board. This was just approved by an internal Facebook review process. Okay.
So basically, what they did was just change the algorithm that decides which stories you see. And for certain people, they put up lots of sad stories, and for certain other people, they put up only happy stories, and so on to see what would happen with the people. And they found that people that saw a lot of sad stories wrote more. Like when they posted their own stuff, it was sad too. And so on.
And they also disengaged from Facebook a little more. The happier a person was, the more likely they were to post and click on advertiser links.
Exactly. So it seems like now Facebook's going to only ever show happy links because it drives advertising to them and so on.
Yeah. But the huge backlash to this, Alan, people are really pissed about this. And Facebook's, what's her name? Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg, she says, "We didn't mean to upset anyone." Well, actually, technically, that's exactly what you meant to do. Technically.
It was more, we meant to see how upset you would get. Yeah. Now we know. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. But, like I mentioned this on Tech Talk today, at the same time, this isn't all that different than what a business like a casino might do, where they paint the ceiling blue and put clouds on there, or a grocery store that sprays water over the vegetables so they look fresh. Right, they're enhancing the experience, or even a podcast that maybe plays music that gets upbeat and gets you excited for the show. Right, that's an attempt to sort of get you pumped for the show. That's all manipulating you at some level. Yeah. Alan, do you feel like what Facebook did is any different from that?
Not really. And like what we saw on, what I saw a lot in comments on like Slashdot, and so like websites do like A/B testing all the time.
Right. Google's famous for this.
Yeah.
Testing like 1,000 shades of blue or whatever.
Right. Or, just even Wikipedia is like, well, let's show some people this donation page and some people this donation page.
Yes, good.
And see which one gets people to pay us more.
And the Reddit ad system also works on this concept of the ones that people click more get different displayed ratios and things like that. Yeah.
Right. And even the Google one does. Or even Google's actual results are based on, hey, if people click on this and they don't come back and click something else, it means they found what they're looking for. So we'll keep showing that one and so on.
Yeah. I'll ask you this question. I brought this up on Tech Talk today. Do you think that because the way Facebook is manipulating you is by displaying you actual things from your friends and family, like maybe like, oh, I'm sick or my dog died, and it's like your mom, it's like people that you're intimately connected with, that it's a different level of manipulation?
When you're intimately connected with people, you see the message either way almost, right? If it's a post by your mom, you probably see it no matter what. It's more your extended network.
And, you're probably right. Yeah, you're probably right.
Something a friend of yours shared from someone you didn't know.
Right.
And that's the stuff they're deciding whether or not they should stick in your face.
Hey, good news for Kim.com. His encryption keys can't be given to the FBI, according to the courts. This is kind of a huge deal. Alan, any thoughts on this one?
A little bit. Yeah, it was just the ruling came out that, they were sending, I think it was actually, who requested it? .com wants access to the seized content of his drives, but they're encrypted.
Yeah.
And the New Zealand court won't allow the key to be given to the FBI.
Right.
So it seems as if .com can't get his own encryption key back.
Well, there is that problem, but it also means the FBI can't get to it, which I think he also prefers. And I don't know, who knows what's in there, but this, it's interesting because we just talked about a story, and then we had an email about a story where somebody was forced to give over to decrypt their information. Here, .com has had the opposite ruling. Yeah. So there's still a shot, folks.
The FBI objected to the request. .com refused to hand over the decryption password unless the court guaranteed him access to his own data. At this point, it was revealed that despite assurances from the court to the contrary, New Zealand police had already sent copies of the data to the U.S. authorities. And so because they've done that when they weren't supposed to, they have to be very careful not to give the FBI the keys, because then that would give them the data that they're not allowed to have.
So we are interchanging two things here in this story. You said in the story it mentions password, but then the headline says
it's
keys.
the password for the key. Well, usually what you have is a key encrypted with a password, right?
I'm thinking like in TrueCrypt, right? It's just the passphrase.
Well, no, because even in I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure in TrueCrypt, it's still, you have a 256-bit AES key
in the background,
which is stored and then encrypted with the passphrase.
Correct. But in terms of interface, you only have to supply a passphrase. And
that passphrase decrypts the key, which then decrypts
functionally, right. But I'm wondering if there is a difference between
basically if the key is encrypted, and so
I'm wondering if there's a difference between requiring an actual key to decrypt something versus requiring just the passphrase that didn't use the key. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you think there could be a difference?
Legally, not really.
Because one thing's almost like an object, but the other thing's like something you have in your head.
Yeah, but basically, when the object's encrypted with the password, it kind of becomes the same thing, right?
True. Well, technically, yeah. All right. Well, that's something for somebody else to figure out. Next story in the roundup: how I got my medal from the Army for writing code. What's this one about, Alan?
Yes. So this was a guy that worked in like the supply division or whatever in the U.S. Army when they were in Iraq, and part of his job every day was to deal with issuing licenses for people for driving the vehicles, and every day they had to do a report on how many of our vehicles are broken down and which ones need maintenance and so on.
Sure, yeah.
And it was all done with this system that was MS-DOS based. It's since then it's been replaced with a newer one that runs on Windows XP. But it was all DOS based. There was no mouse interface. Anyway, so what he did was used an ODBC interface to actually write some Perl to automate some of the reports, and to make it easier, auto-generate the license documents, and to generate the reports every day, and to include more data in the report he generated every day than what most people had, because most people were filling these out by hand. And they're like, all right, we have these many vehicles that are good and these many that are broken down or whatever. And his report was like, here's a list of vehicles that are broken down, and like, here's the ones that are scheduled for maintenance this week or whatever.
Solving a real need, I'm sure.
Yeah, even though technically what he was doing, he wasn't allowed to do because it was outside of his MOS. And
Funny how that works.
But he wrote a whole story about it, and he got the Army Commendation Medal for it.
That's a great story. I really like that story. That's a good one. I'm gonna
like you said, he didn't go set out to do it. It was just interesting to get recognized for his work.
I'm adding that right now, Alan, to my read it later queue, because that seems like a good story right there, and it's nice to hear something like that. All right, our last story this week. I'll be honest, I read this while I was at the cabin, and I thought, this sounds a little bit like fear pumping, a little bit like trying to create a market, but it makes a lot of sense technologically. Hackers target energy companies in the U.S. and Europe, raising sabotage fears. This is from a story at industryleadershipmagazine.com. This is probably a combination of a lot of things we've covered, right, Alan?
Yep.
Is that it? Okay.
Sorry. So basically, we talked a little bit about this last week, right? And they talked about how the malware was targeting anywhere that was using ICS.
Yeah.
And then we have more detail now. Is saying originally they were targeting like defense contractors, but then they switched to targeting power plants and stuff. And it turns out that the code they were using actually allowed them, if they wanted to, they could have sabotaged the electrical grid.
Oh.
And more specifically, they talk about some of the vectors they used to get in, and they saw that some of them, what they did is instead of going after the power plant, which had a bunch of protection in place, they went after the vendor of the ICS system, which is just some small company that nobody knows about. And they broke in there and injected a remote access Trojan into the industrial control software, so that when the plant downloaded a software update and installed it, it actually added a Trojan. And then that gave them not only a foothold in the target company's network, but also provided them a means to mount sabotage operations.
Right.
And the researchers over there at Symantec are quite sure the Russians are involved.
Really?
Yes.
You know what? I could see that. When it's related to energy, I could see that for sure. But Alan, I think you're neglecting to mention the elephant in the room. The really big upset here is that the group that they are charging is responsible is named Dragonfly, which is totally going to step all over the SEO of Dragonfly BSD.
Well, the other one, it has another name. It was like just like Fuzzy Bear or something. It's
Well, it's not bad actually.
Names.
I like Fuzzy Bear. The Dragonfly.
Fuzzy Bear. What was it?
I feel like if you're really a geek, you should leave Dragonfly to the Dragonfly BSD guys. Let them own the Google results, would you?
But Energetic Bear.
Was
the other name.
How could you not go with Energetic Bear over Dragonfly? Think about it, people.
But again, I think both of these names are assigned by antivirus companies, not by the people that were actually behind it.
Actually, Energetic Bear sounds like it was assigned by Canonical, maybe Mark Shuttleworth himself. All right, Alan, well,
It reminds me of this old system I had for trying to come up with funny domain names, and one of them that we came up with was like confusedgorilla.com.
Do you have that still?
No, I never bought it. It was just one of the funny ones that stood out in the list of domains that were available.
I would probably never put a website up at confusedgorilla.com, but if I could have the email address chris@confusedgorilla.com.
It's kind of long, honestly.
But it's so funny, Alan. Every time you say it, it's funny. All right, well, that wraps us up for this week's episode of the TechSNAP program. If you want links to anything we talked about, like that cybersecurity real-time map or any of the stories or the PDF that we were gushing all over earlier in the show, guess what? Alan's copiously linked and documented all of that in the show notes. Just go find TechSNAP 170, and you'll find links in chronological order that we covered them in the show notes. And you can check out anything you want. Also, while you're there, why not grab an RSS feed? Stick it in your favorite podcast catcher. I'm not going to judge what it is. Just stick it in there. Put it in there and get our show every single week, because we do this show at least for 170 weeks so far on a Thursday, and you can download us over at jupiterbroadcasting.com. And if you're maybe not in the Pacific time zone, which I understand maybe a couple of you aren't, it's probably safe to bet it'd be out Friday morning over at jupiterbroadcasting.com.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for tuning in this week's episode of TechSNAP. We'll see you right back here next week.